Welcome to the first episode of Text for Nothing Conversations with Poets. My name is Antonio Ochoa, and my guest tonight is Michael Franco. Since this is the first show, I'm going to read quickly an introduction to explain what the show is about and what we're doing here. The idea of the show is to have an informal conversation with my guests about their work and their opinions about poets, poetry, and poetics. I've also asked them to pick a secondary subject to talk about, which does not necessarily have to be related to poetry. It can, obviously. It doesn't have to. It can be anything they want. For example, Michael today chose Gertrude Stein, being that it would be her birthday. This is a live half-hour show, so we will not be able to talk about all the things we would like to talk about. There might be mistakes and a few bumps along the ride, for which I apologize to Michael and to the public, and I thank them for their understanding. The show is live, but is also being taped and will be available for viewing by visiting textfornothingtv.com. That is textfornothingtv.com. In the website, you will find the videos of the show and extra resources on guest poets, such as their bios, links to their work, and links about them, as well as references to books, movies, or any material mentioned during the broadcast. The show is set to run every first Sunday of the month. The first 5 shows are all lined up, and in the coming weeks, I hope to receive other confirmations. For more information on that, please visit textfornothingtv.com for the full spring schedule. And now let's begin our conversation with Michael. Michael, I have some... so you chose Gertrude Stein to start, and I would like to just begin with a broad idea or the broad outlook and ask you about the impact of her work on your life and work, and then sort of start moving...
Sure.
Smaller bits.
I mean, Stein for me is primary in the most profound way. I discovered her through my high school teacher, Franco, must have been my senior year of high school. And Miss Claggett was an amazing poet herself and was bringing poets in. This is in Alameda, California, in the East Bay near Oakland. And she brought in Robert Duncan and Helen Adam, for example, to come in and read to us at school. And one afternoon she said, there's this incredible film on, you should go watch it. And it's on KQED, which was the counterpart to WGBH in San Francisco. And it was a film by Perry Miller Adoto, who's a great influence on Ken Burns, right? I mean, they cite her, and where she was using pictures of the house and quotes and Stein reading over the top of to make a documentary. And I was just transfixed by the whole thing, and it was an opening into that world of Paris in 1906,
right.
Which was just an extraordinary world to begin with. And then as I started to actually explore Stein and read through her, I mean, anything of mine that you've got here has been opened by her, because
right.
the narrative possibilities that woman opened up for poetry and prose are extraordinary. And in 1970, when all this is that I'm describing to you was going on, there was very little published that you could go out and buy by Stein. You could buy selected writings if you could find one.
Right.
But all the stuff that we have now is not available. And there certainly wasn't the assessment of trying to place her. That people are still arguing over whether or not it was a bunch of meaningless gibberish or not. But what I finally saw, and this would have been as early as the 70s, the mid-70s, I saw this amazing arc of that was indeed hooked to Picasso and that idea of breaking down how we see,
right.
and the whole notion of breaking down how we see is, I mean, not natural, right? I mean, a normal person trying to write a story doesn't say, I want to also break down how you see. They have something they want you to see,
right?
And so that whole figure of reorienting became one of my primary touchstones, and then that led into finding Robert Duncan, of course, because that was the same year.
Right.
And then Robert Duncan had been doing Stein imitations, so in my high school mind, it really was this place opening up, a vortex, you know.
Okay. And so, in your writing, how does you still connect with her? How does that dialogue work? You still having a dialogue with
Well,
her
in a real
work.
simple way, absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah. But in a simple way, it works in that it ranges between the Stein body of work ranges between abstract and absolute storytelling.
Yeah, yeah.
And then to me, the texts that are really interesting is where she starts to amalgamate all those things together, and so that you're getting moments of abstractness, moments of storytelling, and it starts to break down what she would have called consciousness, because that's what her issue was how do you get consciousness onto the page?
Right.
And you don't get that by telling a straight beginning, middle, and end story, because there was that whole push that comes out of the poet Charles Olson from Gloucester, to be non-linear, right?
Right.
And then what I got out of Duncan that then reflected back upon Stein was it's not non-linear, it's alinear.
Right.
Because Duncan's wonderful contribution to me and to everybody, as far as I'm concerned, was that Olson had said we should have poetry by field. And,
Yep.
and no longer beginning, middles, and ends. It was going to be this open field. The image I always, when I have the opportunity to talk to students, that I tell them is, if you imagine a field, the old poetry, heavy air quotes, you wanted to cut a path across that field. The poet did.
Right.
And then turn around and say, Antonio, come, look at what I've done. Look at this. I found this, and I found this, and I found this. Doesn't it have great meaning to you now? Whereas Olson wanted to throw you into the middle of the field, and the poet's job was to create and to find the energy around that reader and him or herself.
Right.
And let that all buzz without that worrying about finding the beginning, the middle, or the end. Well, what Duncan does is Duncan comes along, and there's a letter from him to Olson saying this. He said, well, Charles, if we're going to have, a field and non-linear, doesn't that mean it has to include the linear?
Right.
And you can hear Olson going, please don't screw this up. We just got this opened up, But it's so true, because, and to me it all comes back, to go to Stein, daily living can be existing, is a Stein quote, right?
Right.
This is from The Making of Americans. And it is this whole notion of daily living and existence and consciousness that fascinated her.
Right.
She actually kept notebooks, trying to hold on to all the different kinds of people.
Right, the types.
And was really, and you could feel her when she was on, if I can just get all this down, of course you can't, it constantly escapes you.
But that's one of the things to go segue to your work, because the idea of the everyday existence.
Yes.
There's something about, especially on How to Live, which you take from the plan for
the curriculum of the soul.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's there in that book, and throughout the other books too, there's a thing about finding that meaning of existence, or looking for a certain meaning of existence in the everyday. And at some point you quote Stein, and then talk about how it could also be heroic, like the
exactly.
And so
I would alter what you said. It's not finding the existence in every day, is that it's realizing that it's there.
Right.
I was a good romantic when I was 20, and and I always wanted everything to have meaning and be, and I had friends that would say, "Aren't you going to write a poem about this? This is so powerful." And then I would go home and nothing would happen. I thought, I'm a failed poet. And what I realized is that it's all those little germs and kernels of things that are floating around everybody. It's not just you and me that are poets.
Right.
Vincent Ferrini was wonderful for saying that. The only difference between me and you, I'm a poet, you don't write, is that I write it down. You see the same thing that I do. And if I write it down clean enough, you see it too. And I like that notion that it separates us out from being some kind of, special. There's the shaman poet. That's a whole different, line we can go off on. But to talk about consciousness and existence, and then to bring that back to what I was saying with that field, when you get out of the linear or out of the alinear, if you think about your life, that's the way it works. I mean, you and I have known each other for a number of years now, and we've kind of done this, crisscrossed, and we've touched at points. This could be the beginning of daily contact for the next 20 years.
Right.
You don't know. And then there's people that come into your life, have a huge impact, and are gone. And then there's people that I mean, they're everything, and it just goes that way for the rest of your life.
Right. And in that sort of that sense of structure, can that be something that can be found in your work?
Absolutely.
And like, I'm thinking of a book of measure, and there's that beautiful scene where you walk into the cathedral in Lisbon, and you talk about the light.
Well, that's
and the shade.
That's Maria Torres who's in the Book of Measure,
right?
And she's because the cathedral is actually in Évora.
Okay.
And that the light in there, I've been there. We went down there to do research, right? And again, with my air quotes, and it's just a remarkable place, you know. But yeah, and that's where she started writing. She was hiding her stuff out in the back cloister there, you know,
right?
Because she had paper and she was a girl in the 18th century and not supposed to be doing that kind of stuff.
and so you take, in the Book of Measure, you take several narratives and several books, and you use a very, the way you structure the paragraphs, the way you structure the narrative, you have different layers there. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, because that's the whole idea is, I mean, with the Book of Measure, and again, we're still clinging to start. That's how come, I mean, it was fun to be able to pick that. Because to go back to that idea of the breakdown of form and structure, which is, I'm always nervous saying the breakdown because if you look at Picasso and his process, he never broke things down. He was playing.
Yeah.
And it was an essential, vital play that he was doing, and the play was trying to reorient himself and then the viewer or the reader in Stein's case, so that you're knocked off your assumptions and you come at things differently. So then
right.
in the Book of Measure, that breaking down of those things so that you get those things pushed up against one another, because that's the way I see life as happening, as I was saying. It's not a straight flow of stuff. And I moved, for example, every probably year and a half, 2 years as a kid. My
right.
dad was in the military. And the weirdest thing about that, I mean, there was the obvious thing of being new in some place where you're trying to find habits of daily living all over again.
Right.
But the really weird thing was realizing that all those people that I knew so well had gone on quite merrily without me, and we're still having lives that were rich and doing all the stuff that we used to do. Now it was just, Michael's not here anymore.
Right.
But I became aware, I went back to visit once and realized everybody was really happy to see me, and then they had stuff to do. You know? And that whole structure of life had this very tangible feeling to me. And it just got, as I got older, it got weirder thinking about all these places that I had lived and all the people that were there and all the stories of those people, which is what starts to bubble up in a Book of Measure.
Right, right, exactly. But also, like, there's that Dr. D, and the idea of that Elizabethan theater and having the play within the play. And you were just telling me before, when we were having coffee before the show, about the David Leary book. And
yes.
You were explaining how that whole book came out of a conversation within the narrative of a Book of Measure.
Yes.
Yeah. So.
Well, that was. I mean, there's a letter from Robert Duncan to Charles Olson where he says, "Have you realized that you actually can dream inside the poem? It's really amazing." And when I read that, I suddenly realized that that's one of the things that I had been coming forward to it and then backing off because it seemed like it didn't belong.
Right.
And the whole idea of the Book of Measure was that everything was supposed to be allowed. And I quickly realized I was saying, well, this is great, but it doesn't belong there, and this is great. And I said, I'm actually doing exactly opposite what I said I was going to do.
Right.
And so then I started allowing it to all come in. Well, once it comes in, then you're kind of sitting there going, why is this, as the writer, you're saying, why is this here?
Right.
It's a great question, but it's really unnerving because you don't know why it's there, and then you have to proceed and see if you start to realize, or if you're just, which is always in the back of your head, you're not really a real writer. You're just going on,
right.
And any good editor would fix this, you know. And so, I mean, Dr. D, had been lurking around for a long time as the possibility of a play, and the narrator was going out with somebody in the Book of Measure. This is in the volume you haven't seen. This is in the second volume. There's actually 3. Second volume is complete, and I'm being kicked around by the third volume violently right now because it's not opening up, and I can feel I'm so close to having it span out where I can actually get in there and work. So the narrator goes to this play, and I had years ago tried to write this play, probably 10 years earlier, and I said to myself, this is a chance to come back and readdress Dr. D, because he's this amazing figure from the Renaissance, real person, you know. And once I started, I was there, I was at the theater, and every morning I would get up, I'd make coffee, go down, feed the cat, and sit down, and it was bam, I was back, and I kept saying, my wife kept saying, the neighbors are going to think you're out of your mind because it was summertime, the windows are open, and I was in there going through all the dialogues out loud, yelling and screaming at people and stuff, and it was a grand time, but all this, I should back this up because there's another person lurking here that was the other opening for all this, and that's Fernando Pessoa, because, that was this light bulb coming on, because I've perpetually told the story of the professor that got me to Portugal the first time, where I ended up meeting my wife Isabel, had come to the house because she was interested in Robert Duncan, right?
Right.
And so she had been there several times, and finally she had looked at some of my stuff, she'd heard me read, and we were sitting at the kitchen table, and she said, so I assume you love Pessoa, given what you're telling me. And I said, who? And she said, you have to know Pessoa. And I said, Graça, it's not only do I not know Pessoa, I pride myself. I have at least heard of most of poetry that's going on. I said, I've never heard the name. I'm really sorry. And she said, well, next time I come. So she came back a year later and flopped, at that time, this is probably in 1990. The only available translation in English by Honing from Brown University. And she said, this is all I could find. And I remember she got up and went off to the bathroom, and I was thumbing through it at the kitchen table, and there were all these different names and poems, and the poems weren't at all the same. Not even remotely the same. And she came back from the bathroom, and I said, so Graça, which one of these is Pessoa? And she looked at me and smiled and said, all of them.
Yeah.
And I said, what? And then I started to explore and realized that this man had created, I am not capable of this. Entire bodies of work for all these people. Some of the people criticize the other people that he made up.
It's astrological charts.
Yeah, exactly. And some of them love the work of the other guy, and other people are writing, how could you read this stuff? It's garbage written by a shepherd,
Yeah.
And it's a magnificent body of work. And as a modernist, the fact that I didn't know who he was, the fact that I'd gone through San Francisco State and so on, nobody had ever mentioned this guy, is appalling.
Yeah.
Because he's far more radical in many ways than Pound or any of the group around Pound, as far as and just think of the idea of the best thing that you can possibly write, and you say, I didn't write that. That was Alberto Cairo, not Fernando Pessoa.
Right.
Right.
So,
and that's the way he wanted to publish the stuff. He was just putting these things
well,
out,
he didn't publish that much either.
No,
Like he wrote a lot.
well, they were like a lot of us. They had little magazines and stuff going on, but it wasn't the big houses and stuff. And certainly not the currency he has in Portugal right now. He's like Walt Whitman in Portugal.
Yeah.
As Isabel would tell you, they studied him in elementary school. They were reading, old Sol Salgado, in that beautiful poem that he wrote.
Right. And so, and in the Doctor dissects me the Pessoa with all the different people that he creates in order to write with different poetics, and then you have Dr. D that has to do with a lot of the famous library and the way he related, the way you write books within books. How is your connection to reading, your connection to libraries, your connection to that world? Just a little bit of that.
Well, I as my wife would tell you, we live in a mass of books everywhere in the house, and to me, books, to begin with, are like what I was just describing to you about moving when my dad was in the Navy and leaving those little clusters of life. And that's what a book is to me.
Right.
And I love old books for that very reason. I love an old hardbound book with, where you can still feel the letterpress of the type and so on, because it carries more than just the text. It carries an entire world in that book. And so then what happened, to go all the way back, I started reading, and again in quotes. As I was writing, I started. I worked on this. The first volume was completed in 97, 98. couple years of tuning and stuff, and then I started into the second volume, which I finished in 2014. So it was that long a period of time.
Right.
And at some point, I was, bored is a terrible pejorative to put on it, but I was getting restless.
Yeah.
And so the creation of these other books was this wonderful way to go read something else besides, and just to let something happen inside of the book. I mean, one of the experiences you have in the Book of Measure is that the narrator is the Maria Torres text that you were just talking about, where she goes into the cathedral. That's a manuscript that he has stolen. Right. And he keeps picking up, when he's sitting on the bus, he starts to read another little piece of it that he's nabbed and pulls out of his backpack. And so it's broken up, so it's read in bits and pieces, and
right.
which is really me, because that's I'm really dyslexic, so I read very, very slowly. And I read in bits and pieces because I just get exhausted. I can't see anymore.
Right.
So it was, it's all... You can't escape yourself. That's the fun thing about writing, even when you think you are.
Yeah. I didn't know you were dyslexic. That's another thing that makes me think about your relationship to sound.
Yes.
So if you are relating to language, not necessarily in a logical sequence of concepts, but in a more
it's a jumble.
Imagination and sound.
That puts it nicely.
Yeah.
I came to start to realize, I didn't discover the dyslexic business until I was in my mid-30s.
Right.
And I had a bartender at a restaurant that I was working in was looking at the way I wrote, and he said, "So how dyslexic are we?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he was teaching dyslexic kids and sat with me over dinner one night showing me all this stuff. And at that point, I started to actually think about, well, what does this mean? Because it started to answer a lot of questions. And one of the questions, this is a reason I think I grabbed onto Robert Duncan. Because Robert Duncan, when you think of his lines, there's all those inline caesuras.
Yeah.
And he actually counted those. So when you would go hear him read, he would read the next part of the text.
Right.
Like that, with his hand beating out the number of beats that he heard in between the lines. It was this beautiful thing. And I think it gave me time to gather up and to hold on, or to actually ultimately to get released into what was going on. And instead of trying to hold on so tightly and realizing that I had gotten lost, which is what the normal experience was,
Right. And that also, so in terms of the poetry, hearing things that you like, you had a reading series for more than 10 years, and now you have another reading series in your press room. So that is the experience of listening to poetry is very, very different from reading poetry.
Absolutely.
So
and the oral experience is primary as well. This goes back to that same teacher, Frank Claggett, in high school, who had weekly poetry readings for us.
Right.
You just had to walk in with your gym, and get up during lunch. We all sat and had lunch together and read poems to each other for a couple of years.
Right.
There was probably 13, 14 active poets at the high school level.
Oh, wow.
She just she took us out to Berkeley and San Francisco State, and she would sort of, put us in, we thought we were giving readings, but we were sitting in front of people that were studying to be teachers most of the time.
Right.
And she was saying, so what are you going to do with these kids, But so the idea of poetry readings was essential. And then when Duncan comes into my life, he would constantly saying that reading a poem out loud far superseded getting it published. Because the connection with the community was vital for him.
Right.
And the connection with sound was vital. And having those two things put together and presented gave you more information about where you were than any kind of publication was ever going to do.
Oh,
because,
that's awesome.
well, you never get to know who's reading.
Yeah.
You can write something and somebody's sitting in their living room and it's saving their life, in your fantasy, right? But that can occur. I've had people come to me and say, "Oh, that meant so much to me." And
yeah.
I never knew. They hadn't written me a letter, and when you're sitting in front of an audience and nobody's picking up on what you're doing, it's quite loud.
Yeah.
There's that noise that's coming into the room, and vice versa. There's a certain level of silence that comes on a room when people are with you. That can be also equally as unnerving, because the back of your head suddenly says, "Oh goodness."
Right.
This is happening.
Yeah.
People are there, and
attention.
to stay with the poem in the place that you've created that's what I drew out of Duncan, was that the series of poetry readings, the person reading was creating a place for art to occur with the people that you were, the community in which we lived, right? The composition in which we lived is the Stein line. It's so beautiful. And that really, was settled in my head.
Right.
And that hooks up with Bill Graham in San Francisco. And that's the thing that Bill Corbett, in that Anya article you were asking me about earlier,
right.
It was he immediately picked up on from talking to me, because Bill Graham ran the ballrooms that the Grateful Dead and the Airplane and all those people, and they were small rooms. They were supposed to hold maybe 1,000 people. He was cramming a lot more than that in there. Everybody sitting on the floor together. But he treated us like guests, right?
Right.
And he was standing at the top of the stairs most nights. Good evening, handing out apples and flowers, and how are you doing, and just checking out the audience, and it was personal.
Yeah.
That's the point that I'm trying to make. It was personal. It was building the community, and you had to to cleave to that in order to be where you were.
I would just give him the 1 minute signal.
Okay.
So this is all the time we have for today. Thank you, Michael, for being here. It's been absolutely amazing. Thank you for tuning in. I'll see you next month, Sunday, March the 3rd at 6:30 for a conversation with Kevin McKellen. This has been Text for Nothing, Conversations with Poets. I'm your host, Antonio Ochoa. The show will be available for viewing online. Simply go to the website, textfornothingtv.com. If you'd like to leave any comments or questions or make any suggestions, please, you can go to the leave a message in the contact tab of the website. Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Are we off the air?